you very much. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who's David, Professor David Jones, I should say. You can read his biography, as indeed all the biographies in the handout in your packs you've got, but let me just highlight a couple of things. First of all, he was an undergraduate in Cambridge and then did a PhD in Oxford, so he's got a good pedigree. He's coming back to Cambridge now. And his PhD was on approaching the end on this very topic we're talking about today. A theological exploration of death and dying, it was published as. He's now director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre in Oxford. He's been doing that for the past 8 years, I guess, something like that. So he's going to talk to us particularly with that aspect in view. And you can read all the other stuff he does in his biography. So, David, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, and if we can manage about 45 minutes or so, then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and then lunch will be after that. Sure. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yes, I was at Cambridge, and then I am at Oxford, but, and I also have the chair, but it's not in Oxford, it's in Twickenham. And the centre that I run is named after someone who was professor in Cambridge, but an undergraduate in Oxford. It goes both ways. My doctorate was on the theology of death, and I'm very interested in the theology of death, but that I'm not going to talk about this today. I want to talk about medical ethics, kind of standard approaches to medical ethics, and how that might be improved. I'll just allow myself one thing I was going to say, almost as a sort of a question or a comment after hearing the end of John's talk. At the end of my book, I end with just a little meditation on the appearance of Jesus to Peter in John's Gospel, where he says to Peter, when you were young, you girded yourself and you went where you will. And when you are old, others will gird you and take you where you would rather not go. And this was said in order to show by what death he would glorify God. So this is about martyrdom. It is about him being scorched as a martyr. But it's also, I think, just as there's one of those ancient paradoxes about what has the riddle of the phoenix, about what has first 4 legs, then 2 legs, then 3 legs. Mm-hmm. And it's a human being who first walks on, crawls, and then stands up, and then has 3 legs with a stick. Mm-hmm. So it's also, I think, a reference to being dependent and then independent and then dependent. But that reversion to dependence is also seen as an opportunity for a kind of surrender, as an opportunity for the surrender of martyrdom. And the fact that it is something which is accepted and partly not chosen in how it's accepted, but not chosen in the circumstances, is also part of what makes it like martyrdom. But that's all the theology you're getting, I'm afraid. So now back to ethics. So medical ethics, the subject that I'm sort of mainly do, bioethics or healthcare ethics or medical ethics, I say to people, is basically just moral philosophy done badly. So it's about trying to think about morals in a philosophical way, but just apply them in a particular context in relation to healthcare, and it reflects on deep thoughts about where our morals comes from, and the thoughts of some great moral philosophers of the past, but typically not directly, typically via not even a secondary source, not even tertiary source. Usually it's a popularization of a simplification of a philosopher. So moral philosophy, just a sort of 2-minute whole of modern moral philosophy. A modern moral philosophy in the English-speaking world really starts with Hume, I think David Hume. David Hume, for moral philosophy, like René Descartes for speculative philosophy, is thought of, whether he did or not is independent, it's not the issue, he's thought of as somebody who kind of sweeps away the past, who says you can't believe the approaches, all the approaches of the past had a kind of flaw in them, and I will tell you how to do it differently. And people believe the first bit but not the second. So what happens after Hume is that Hume is sort of presenting a problem which you then have to solve but you don't go back before that because he has somehow demolished what goes before. And in this way, he's quite like Descartes in other parts of philosophy. So Hume does this, and that's in the 18th century, so David Hume's Scottish philosopher, 18th century. And then in the 19th century, there are various people who respond to this, and the two probably most important, the two greatest philosophers, in a way, great philosophers, would be in Germany, well, in Königsberg, Immanuel Kant, and in England, Jeremy Bentham. And you have utilitarianism as an idea, and Kantian philosophy, which is all about a kind of autonomy based on reason, a sort of very strong notion of reason, that we can just understand it by reason. And in different ways, Kant and Bentham both thought they had a solution to Hume's problem, and they both thought they were re-establishing ethics in a new way. And Kant and Bentham, very different from one another, but were hugely influential. Then what happens in the 20th century is that you have various people who think, oh, we've got these two great people, not great in terms of you necessarily agree with them all, but hugely influential, really powerful sort of ideas. Wouldn't it be nice to sort of bring them together somehow in a tidy, packageable kind of way? And in particular in the 30s, well, in fact, not just the 30s, but 1930 precisely, you can date this. A philosopher called C.D. Broad wrote a book called 5 Types of Ethical Theory. I know it's called 5 Types of Ethical Theory, it's really about 2 types of ethical theory, so boiled down to 2. And he divided all ethical theories into 2, deontological and teleological. Just as a hands up, just so I have a sense of my audience, who has heard of the phrase deontological ethics? Right, so quite a lot. So that's where it comes from. It comes from. I mean, I think deontology was used as a phrase by Bentham, so it floated around a bit. But the notion that you could divide the world, just as in politics, you know, every child is born alive as either a conservative or a liberal. In Gilbert and Sullivan. So the dividing of all ethical theories into either you're a deontologist or you're a teleologist, that's 1930, C.D. Broad. Also in 1930, a chap called W.D. Ross wrote a book called The Right and the Good. And he divided ethical theories which are about what is right and ethical theories which are about what is good. So some things are about rights, what is a rule or an obligation or a duty, right and wrong, and this is kind of the influence. Kant would be the archetype of this. And some ethical theories about what's good, what will be useful, about consequences, about value or worth, I mean, there are many philosophers that fall into that, but Bentham would be the kind of idea. Either it's mainly about what's right or it's mainly about what's good. And for deontologists, what is good is what is right. Or rather, no. For deontologists, what is right is good, and for teleologists, what is good is right. So for Kant, if it's right, then it is the good thing to do. Whereas for Bentham, if it's good, then it's the right thing to do. So you have a notion presented that there are 2 kinds of people in the world, 2 kinds of philosophers, 2 kinds of ethical theories, and everybody is basically one or the other. And then school children and undergraduates and anybody who comes across ethics gets taught this from 1930 through, well, basically to the present, but particularly up until the 70s. So you have the notion that you have these 2 basic camps. Then in the 1970s, you have a sudden interest in research ethics. This is for practical reasons. This is because you'd have various scandals, particularly the Tuskegee, these trials done on African Americans with syphilis who weren't properly informed that they were in trials and weren't given treatment. And there was a lot of soul searching, and they thought, well, we need a system for dealing with research ethics. We need ethics committees or something. And where do you get ethics from? Oh, well, we'll have a committee. So they had a committee, the Belmont Committee, and that came up with 3 principles: respect for persons, beneficence and justice. And 2 people who were on that committee then decided, we'll add a 4th for slightly more balanced than 3. And so they divided respect for persons into autonomy and non-maleficence. And you had the creation of the 4 principles in a book called Principles of Biomedical Ethics, first edition 1979, Beecham and Childress. They taught it as a summer school at Georgetown. So they had a summer school for medics, came along, and the book of the course was Principles of Biomedical Ethics, and it became hugely influential. And I don't, so hands up who has heard of the 4 principles. So if you haven't, look around, lots of people have. It's a very standard way of teaching medical ethics. The 4 principles, and 2 of them are about what's right, autonomy, non-maleficence, and 2 are about what's good, beneficence and justice. Justice here means really distributive justice. It means resource allocation. So it's about fairly sharing out the pie. So it is about the good rather than about, as it were, human rights. And it's the kind of issue, how you share out resources, which utilitarians are very interested in, as opposed to individual rights types. So you have still this kind of basic division. 4 principles. The 4 principles have something to them, I think, and it is a right instinct to try to take from different philosophers the truths that are in them and bring them together. There are problems with 4 principles of various kinds, but I think it wasn't a bad idea. And I want to try to apply these 4 principles to withdrawal of treatment. So that's the kind of the issue that John was talking about a bit. So if we're thinking about when is enough enough, when is enough treatment enough, is the other question is when do you start withholding treatment or when do you withdraw the treatment that you're already given. So the issue of withholding or withdrawing relates to the question of when is enough enough. It relates to it way outside end-of-life issues. I mean, all medicines are poisons. They all have side effects. They sometimes work and sometimes don't. Whatever the treatment's for, there might come time, well, actually, this isn't doing me any good, let's try something else. That's not just end of life, that's just medicine. That not all medicines do what you hoped that they would do, and some turn out to be too burdensome. So withholding and withdrawing treatment is not just about end of life, but it becomes more pointed, more existential at the end of life, because at the end of life, withdrawing it might be the occasion for someone dying. But also at the end of life, you really are up against the limits of medicine. Whatever medicine can do, it can't make you live forever. So, whereas medicine can be quite effective in doing other things, there will come limits to medicine as there comes a limit to life. And so the question of when medicine is effective anymore, those kind of questions are much more likely to come up as you're sort of hitting the buffers, as it were. Though it's a question which is general. So, typically in contemporary medical ethics and law, WW means there, withholding and withdrawing. As an aside, there is a question about whether withholding is the same as withdrawing or whether withholding is not the same as withdrawing. Different people have different views about this. There's an interesting difference of religious views on this. There's more of a difference within Judaism. Withdrawal of treatment can be an act and comes under a different kind of way of weighing it up than withholding treatment. And so there are much bigger issues within Judaism about withdrawal of continuous treatment on which people depend for their lives. The Catholic view, which is the tradition I come from, wouldn't make that distinction, but I still think that there is typically a distinction between withholding and withdrawing. But often you can do both. And the reasons that you do one are similar to the reasons that you do another. If you think there isn't a difference, I don't know. Well, just as a hands up, let's do hands up. Hands up people who think that withholding treatment and withdrawing treatment are ethically the same. So, but that's, or perhaps hands up, perhaps just everybody else is nervous. Hands up who think they're ethically different. Let's say there's a difference between withholding treatment and withdrawing treatment. All right, so quite a lot of people, but some people haven't. Some people have withheld. They will, whether they're in favour or not. The standard view, which is kind of DNA view, is that there is no difference. The GMC once said that there was no difference. The GMC, I'm now glad to say, doesn't say that, because it doesn't need to say that. It only needs to say you are allowed to withdraw as well. And you shouldn't be afraid to give treatment because you're afraid to withdraw it. That's the real point. But that doesn't mean to say that withdrawing and withholding are the same, because typically they're not. And there's a big difference between not lending someone a fiver and lending it and then asking for it back. Typically, it's painful to withdraw something that you have, because for human, at least psychological reasons. Anyway, that's an aside. The four principles. So the four principles apply to withdrawal of treatment. Autonomy, the principle of autonomy justifies the right of patients to refuse unwanted treatment, and this becomes a very important issue I'll come to. But when we're thinking about should you have it or should you not, a fundamental issue is, well, does the patient want it, and is the patient allowed to refuse? And the right of a patient to refuse is to do with the right of autonomy. The principle of autonomy is that you can always refuse the doctor. The second sort of practical principle is, or practical application, is that the doctors have a right or duty not to provide treatment that's harmful or futile. So doctors are there to help us. If the doctor thinks that this will do no good and might do harm, then the principle of non-maleficence, not doing harm, do no harm, that is a reason not to give the treatment, even if somebody asks for it. So the patient says, oh, I'd like to have this medicine, and the doctor says, well, for you it would do harm, not good, and I'm not going to give it to you. And the doctor also has, and this is a bit more political, but it's very important, the doctor also, or the health service, maybe the individual doctor, maybe the health service, also reasonably might wish to prioritise needs, and so also might not give something because somebody else might need it more. I once was in a taxi which was driven by someone who was an ex-nurse who had been in Bratislava before coming over here and working as a taxi driver. And in the hospital where he worked in Bratislava, there was one ITU bed. You only need to see it. You only need to say it to think the use of that. Somebody says, should that be used in this case? You obviously think, well, who else might need it? How urgent is this case as opposed to other cases? We don't have that kind of situation, but we have analogous situations. And I don't know, I'd be interested in talking to John afterwards, how near these kind of decisions are, or how much, but even if they're not in the immediate frame, they're in the larger frame of how much resource is given to different kinds of treatment, to different specialities, and to what kinds of treatments are available, what kit you have in the first place, how many beds you have in the first place, and so on. And that then makes that decision about what's practical. And thirdly, doctors have a duty to provide beneficial treatment to patients who are in their care, subject to justice. So it's a duty on doctors to give beneficial treatments to patients. So they have a duty not to give futile treatments, but they also have a positive duty to give healthcare. That's what they're for. They are doctors. So they have a sort of a duty to do good. For Beecham and Childress, these people who came up with the four principles, in theory the principles were all just prima facie principles, stronger than rules of thumb, rules which applied if other things didn't, but when they came into conflict they were all, none of them were indefeasible. So you would say, well, patient autonomy is important, but it might have to be qualified in various ways, so justice is important, but it might have to be qualified. So all of the principles are not absolutes, They're rules which are subject to qualification depending if they come into conflict with other principles. They're prima facie principles. And in theory, they were all equal, but in fact, autonomy was primus inter pares, first among equals, and increasingly, if you're interested in, this is a bit anorak type things to do, but if you look up the editions from, I think we're on 7th at the moment, from 1979 up until the present, autonomy gradually grows in stature. So there is a shift, but it's there in the beginning, right from the beginning, that they are all equal, but some are more equal than others, and there's a move towards autonomy, patient autonomy. Patient autonomy, not doctor autonomy. This is a period where patient rights and people thinking patients were not treated seriously, the humanity of patients wasn't seen seriously enough, and over time there has been a gradual emphasis on autonomy, patient autonomy, and the importance of patients, but at the expense of the ability of the doctors to have their own autonomy. So we've gone from, to take a caricature, we've gone from doctors treating patients as though they were vets, they just treat the patients, patients good without having to inform the patient, to patients treating doctors like coffee machines. So we've gone from a patient without any autonomy to a doctor without any autonomy. I caricature, but only a little. So there's this shift, and patient rights become hugely important. So there is the principle of autonomy, but it's applied to patients. For patients, patient choice, so that you also have a language of patient choice, which is to do with this principle of autonomy, has strengthened the right of refusal. So the right of refusal is now a quasi-absolute. It's still not quite an absolute if they don't have capacity or if a certain mental health law, but it's a very, very strong principle, certainly stronger than any other practical application in this field. But what's not at all strong is the ability of patients to demand treatment. So the principle, the ability to demand treatment is relatively weak. So you have an extremely strong ability to refuse and a mildly strong ability to request. Doctors similarly, because they have a duty not to harm, if they can say that the treatment is futile or harmful, then they're in an extremely strong position. Whereas what duties they have to provide particular treatments is much weaker. So both the patients and the doctors, ethically, in this kind of tradition, they're on stronger grounds when they don't do something than when they do. And hence in practice the default is the power of the patient is to refuse and the power of the doctor is not to provide. And that is a recipe for conflict. Particularly because patient choice is presented as an aspiration, and yet it mainly, as a real trump card, is something which has force, particularly legal force, really only allows people to refuse, which is not necessarily what most people are concerned about. It is what some people are concerned about, and it's real and important, and I think it is right that in general it's a stronger right. But it's easy for patients to get frustrated when they're told, oh, it's all about choice, but of course you can't have that in this hospital, and actually we don't do that, and I'm not sure that would suit you. And so choice actually means you can say no when we offer you something, but it doesn't mean that that we will give you something which will make you better, necessarily. So there was a very important case called Burke versus the GMC, where Leslie Burke, a man who was disabled, was concerned that he might not be given clinically assisted nutrition and hydration when he needed it, and he was very frustrated with the GMC guidance, which said he had a right to refuse this, but he didn't have a right to require it. which he said he has a right to die but not a right to live, and that seemed perverse. So he took the GMC to court saying, the only right you give me is a right to be starved to death, not a right to eat when I want to. So the appeals court were really quite sympathetic to him. When he went to the Supreme Court, he lost. But in a way he lost, in a way he won, because the Supreme Court said, well, what he wanted was for the GMC to revise its guidance. Clearly the guidance isn't communicating in the way that it should do, so I think the GMC should revise its guidance. So he lost, but what he wanted still had to happen, but not quite in a way. So they did revise his guidance. With a non-competent patient, you have an even greater problem, because if you think that everything is about autonomy, what do you do when somebody doesn't have autonomy? Well, you have to default to beneficence or non-maleficence. Or what you have to do is you have to create quasi-autonomy, advanced decisions or proxies, and say, even though these are not autonomy, because if I could make decisions and somebody was saying, your representative said this, then that's not right, you would see it's not right. I mean, if you've written something down on a piece of paper and you were still competent, somebody could ask you and you could say, actually, no, I don't believe that anymore. That's autonomy. If you're not around, something that you wrote on a piece of paper is the best that there is, but it isn't like a person who you can talk to and who can express their views about a particular situation which is in front of them. It's a proxy, and a proxy is even more of a proxy. I mean, a power of attorney. A power of attorney can respond to things, but they are not you. So it is not your autonomy. I mean, it's your autonomy to appoint somebody who isn't you, but it's still not you. It is them. And the problem with a power of attorney as a sort of concept is that no one thinks that they're not a good judge of character. But some people are not good judges of character. So that's why within the law on attorneys there are also ways in which attorneys can be challenged, and attorneys don't have the same powers, not quite the same powers as the original person does, because sometimes people appoint people who either are not very good at thinking about what their best interest would be, or don't even have their best interest at heart, I'm afraid. Anyway, I'll move more quickly now. So in general, you have these cases which keep coming to court, and my impression is there are more cases of this kind. So a lot of the kind of conflict cases which are coming to court are cases in way of withdrawal treatment or withholding treatment. There's obviously two of the few baby cases we've had recently, but in a way, you could say it's the same almost with the assisted dying cases. It's about withholding something that they would like. So they're allowed to, for people who wish to have assistance to end their life, assistance suicide, they already have the right to refuse treatment, but they want not the right to refuse treatment, but they want the right to demand, or at least to have provided, a particular kind of intervention which they think is a treatment, which is assisted dying. And by and large, in court, what happens is the right to refuse cases, the patient always wins. The right of non-provision, the doctor tends to win. Accept the right of the patient, the duty of the doctor to provide knowledge, the right of the patient to know something, where the patient tends to win. And the DNA CPR, do not resuscitate orders, is an example of that. Who makes the decision in the withdrawal? That still stays with the doctor, but the doctor now has to talk more about it. So, not a right to actually give the CPR, not a duty to give the CPR, but a duty to give some information about why they're not giving the CPR. But in general, I think you have these kind of conflicts. Increased aspiration, unacknowledged limits. Yes, I didn't. So another. I'll have to say this. So Beneficence is about benefiting people. Non-maleficence, not doing harm. Autonomy, accepting what I say. Autonomy, respecting somebody's decision as their decision when they are responsible for making it. Justice, taking into account other competing needs. Justice is a real and an important ethical principle, but it is one which is not acknowledged in society. Politicians do not say they are rationing healthcare. They do not say they will ration healthcare. They do not say they need to ration healthcare. They might accuse other people of rationing healthcare, but they don't say, we do this, we used to do this, we have to do this, because medicine is actually better than it used to be at doing good, the result of which is that we can't, all the good we could, all the medical benefit we could do on one person, we can't do for everyone. Because we keep inventing new ways of doing good, but they're all expensive. So there is a different kind of limit. It's a limit because medicine is good at doing its job. If medicine was rubbish, it couldn't do very much. It wouldn't be difficult to share it out. Because medicine can do lots, there's a problem of there's always more that it could do, but it can't because of the limits of time or money or people or other kinds of resources. So we have resource things. Because people don't want to talk about this, and because I was talking to a paediatrician, it was interesting, there was a couple of people in conversation who were saying, if you introduce the fact that this might be an issue into a conversation, you're more likely to have conflict. So it's better, even if it's true that it's there, it's really a recipe for conflict. If they say, your baby might not get treated because we don't have enough beds and we'd like to give it to somebody else. So instead you say, I don't think this will be beneficial, or I think it might be futile, or that is to say, you are talking about the benefits and you are talking about the burdens, but you're framing it in terms of how you're weighing it against the fact that resources are limited, but you don't acknowledge that frame. And that's a bit of a problem, I think. And it's not just neonatology, but this is a general problem. Right. That's the problem. What's the solution in 2 minutes? See, I've timed it well. So there's a section here which I won't go into, but I'll just say under section 4, that's just sort of historical to say that Elizabeth Anscombe, after whom my centre was named, wrote a short piece in 1958 which alerted people to the need for a different kind of way of approaching modern moral philosophy. But it was really in the late 1970s and early 1980s that virtue theory really emerged on the theme, on the scene as another way of approaching ethics, different from consequentialism or teleology systems aimed at good, different from deontology. Classical virtue theory associated with Aristotle, the philosopher, and Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic Dominican, has a place for rules, but rules are not everything. It has a place for consequences, but consequences are not everything. Its key idea is character, that your character is formed by what you do and informs what you do. And also that in terms of acting out of a good character, the right action is typically a mean between two vices. So the problem sometimes with rules is either you follow the rule or you don't. So you have that's black and white, that's yes, no, that's binary. The problem with calculations is either you get the calculation right or you don't. And so both of those tend in the direction of saying there's just one kind of error. Whereas virtue theory from the beginning says that what is right is usually in the middle between different kinds of errors. So the classical example is courage. Courage is a virtue. What is the opposite of courage? Cowardice. For Aristotle, that's one opposite, but there is another opposite, which is
rashness.
Rashness. rushing in where angels fear to tread, because you are too stupid to realise it's dangerous, like the Celts, he says. This is thousands of years ago, this one. Or sometimes, and this is a sort of a beautiful insight really of Aquinas, some people are rash because they don't fear losing something because they don't love it enough. So some people throw their lives away, not because they surrender their lives for a worthwhile cause, but because they do not realise the value of what they hold. So the mean of courage is a mean between being too afraid and this is typical of the virtues in general. So I'll now skip right to the chase. How does this apply to refusals of treatment? It's not just about a right, yes, no right of the patient or of the doctor, or a calculation of benefit, though it involves both rights and consequences. What's necessary is the integration of virtues of both of the physician and of the patient. Virtues of honesty, justice, compassion. I didn't put temperateness down, but temperateness actually is very important in this context because it's about our desires, moderating our desires. Because the desire to live long and to be healthy, that's a good desire. But all our desires are subject to excess as well as defect. This is an Aristotle insight. All our desires for good thing are subject to excess as well as defect. And our desire to live a long life can be something which we desire too much. And we know it's too much when other things get sacrificed that shouldn't be sacrificed. There is a virtue. So there's a virtue between the vices of under-treatment and over-treatment. Under-treatment which neglects life because it doesn't value it enough. Over-treatment because it denies death. It doesn't accept death. The acceptance of death is also the acceptance of our limits is a virtue which is related to temperateness but also to honesty in a way. Another thing that Aristotle says, which is less well known, but certainly is in the strand of virtue theory, which comes from Aristotle and Aquinas, is that some acts are incompatible with virtue. Though in general virtue expresses a mean between two vices, there are also some kind of actions which, because of the nature of the action, they contradict what the action is about. So he says, for example, adultery. You don't say, well, I have a moderate amount, not too much, not too little. You say, no, this kind of action undermines the good of marriage. So marriage, lots of aspects of virtuous marriage are about too much and too little. Too much time, too little time, too much smothering, too much distance. Lots of things about marriage which are virtuous are about finding a balance. But there are also things which are simply incompatible with the notion of the activity. That's a kind of Aristotelian idea, which would also apply to the end of life. So within this tradition, the deliberate ending of life, the killing of the innocent, is wrong, and it's not wrong because of the moral lessness. It's wrong because it contradicts the aim of the exercise, the aim of health. So what a doctor is for, that's not what a doctor is for. I mean, it's what an executioner is for, might be what a vet is for sometimes, but it's not what a doctor is for. To justify that, you need a lot to think about what is a doctor for and how you would find that out. But at least there are some actions which are incompatible with the you might say the vocation of doctor, the meaning of doctor, and so you rule those out. But having ruled those out, you still have not what you don't do, but what you do. And there you need virtue, which means you need to find the mean, which isn't something that is given automatically. It's something which requires practice. It requires a virtue of prudentia, which comes with learn, but also through discussion with others, and also it requires support from your education, but also from others in society through the ethos of a particular culture. And it is often the case that when people act badly, even if they would be otherwise would be virtuous, it's because there's an ethos within a particular environment which prevents them acting as they wish to do spontaneously as virtuous people, and prevents the cultivation of the virtues. And that's true in the subculture of medicine, but it's also true of the larger culture of society. And so some of these questions in relation to thinking about our limits and thinking about technology and talking, do we talk to one another about what we would like? That's partly what sets the context within which people can cultivate the virtues which they need to make the decision of when enough is enough. So the question is one, Aristotle says, if you want to know what is good, ask a good person, which might seem circular, but what it means is that it's by cultivating dispositions through the kind of actions that we do day to day, through the way in which we try to integrate the different things that we value, through the way in which we make prudent decisions, that we also wish in this context to make prudent decisions. Vices could be found in doctors and in patients. It's not that the doctor is always right, or the patient's either all the patient's relatives. But we need to think about ways to help people make decisions for themselves, because that's part of human action, but also with the help of others, because acting with others is also very human. And so we need to think not just of the immediate, but of the kind of ethos within the profession and within society which can form the dispositions both of doctors and of patients. And I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, David. Got a question straight away.
David, thank you so much for an incredibly enlightening talk. My question, in a sense, relates to some of what you've said, but also what John started talking about earlier today. I'm doing a piece of work trying to understand better the perspectives of Muslim patients and families at the end of life.
Yes.
And what they describe also is about balancing virtues and deliberating between lots of different types of moral sources and understandings. But I guess one of the things that I found in the research is less to do with the balancing of two extremes or vices, as you've described, and less to do with, for example, the issue of adultery and things being out of the realm of what's being deliberated, but more to do with the challenges of balancing goods. So, for example, at the end of life, how we balance hope alongside acceptance.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the balancing of goods or balancing of absolute virtues, and whether John would want to add to that discussion too.
Thank you. That's a beautiful question. I think most decisions in life needn't be about between vice and virtue, and people who are virtuous have lots of interesting decisions in their life which are about how they balance the various goods and are not struggling against vice. So, and that's a very important part of virtue. And the balance here is a metaphor. It was more obviously a metaphor in the PowerPoint that John had, because you have a seesaw. That's a picture. Picture is a metaphor. Balancing is a metaphor. The way in which we integrate the things we want to do at the same time isn't necessarily best expressed by that metaphor, I say. And taken from a Christian point of view, G.K. Chesterton once said, Christianity gets over the problem of furious opposites by keeping both and keeping both furious. And sometimes what is required is to keep both furious, to keep, not to think that you're involved in a kind of trade-off. And there's a big difference between compromises which compromise both and attempts to keep both furious, even though you know that in a way you're attempting the impossible, but you're allowing both to be themselves. You're not trying to trade off, and I think that there we should be careful about our metaphors and balance. That's why balance is not necessarily good metaphor.
John, do you want to add anything?
Just to say again, I think it's an excellent and challenging question. And you're right that balancing can be an unhelpful metaphor. I think the idea of a trade-off is a helpful idea. That it's one of the things that Atul Gawande talks about in his book, that helping people at the end of life see that they can't have their cake and eat it. There are trade-offs. If you go for A, that will mean inevitably that you're not going to be able to have B and C. Now, which of these trade-offs do you feel is of most importance in your own life and in your family life and so on? So I think that kind of helping, they're all, A, B and C are all good, but you can't have them all, and therefore, which is most important to you?
And then there are examples where they can both be good. I mean, I think that's very important to say, that somebody has a choice between being a doctor or being a teacher, and they could both be good things, and whichever decision they make could be a good thing. So there's a sense here of vocation also, in the personal.
There's a saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. What is the value of advanced decisions? Can you really make them? And will they be relevant when the time comes?
Yeah, I'm not sure atheists in foxholes. My view, and it was, I think it's in the last question, my view in relation to religion in this is that the religion doesn't change where the balance lies. There, I've used the metaphor, I said it wasn't a good metaphor. But it doesn't necessarily change where the balance lies, but it changes both sides. And it gives us more reason to value this life, and it gives us more reason to accept. So I don't think it necessarily changes. It changes everything, but it doesn't necessarily change the balance. But in relation to advanced decisions, I think some of I'm slightly wary of some of the issues of control in this area. So in one way, giving control in small things, where people have control in small things, can be hugely significant for people. On the other hand, part of acceptance is recognizing that death is not under your control. You don't have a choice of whether you die or not. And there's a kind of acceptance which is the acceptance of a loss of control. And I'm more wary of kinds of attempts to give control which seem to be unreal. So I'm all for the significance of what people choose to wear in the last few days may be hugely important for them. I mean, there are some small decisions which will be hugely important, but also there might be bigger questions about controlling death or controlling the whole situation, which people might think they get by something which actually won't give them that, where that sort of a wish to control, I think, is itself a sort of vice. It's thinking that there could be control in a way which transcends my mortality, and I think that's a mistake. And I think that the advanced decisions, they may be helpful or they may not. But I don't think that they offer the kind of control that people think they might. I think I agree with John. Writing out your wishes and feelings, what you're afraid of and what you hope for, these are useful things to help somebody make decisions for you when you're not around to make them. But the idea that you could somehow be still making them from a distance, and that what you're doing is you're actually trying to control from a distance what it is you're doing, and that's what an advanced decision. If you think that's what an advanced decision, then it's not going to achieve that, and it seems to me it's kind of misplaced hope or misplaced effort, and the efforts should be placed somewhere where it's real, even if limited, and also it should be more about communication with people, because that's also a thing that makes a big difference, is speaking about these things.
Any more questions or comments? Oh, well, we'll come to the back in a minute. So.
It seems to me that in both talks, dishonesty and lack of transparency is really paramount, because whatever we hear today we go into situations as individuals where doctors really don't spell out what the choices are. They don't, I think John, you said, killing pain doesn't kill the patient, but it can. You know, we all know we've given that last dose of morphine, and it did, you know, contribute to killing the patient, but it was necessary because that's what we needed to do to kill the pain. And I just think there's a lack of honesty, rationing in the health service, and how that, what that means for us as we grow older, and most of us here are growing older. You never hear people say, well, maybe I don't need that operation, maybe it could pay for.
It's not only that, I mean, I think patients occasionally are dishonest with their doctors. I mean, I think that, and with themselves. Yeah. And so we play various kinds of games, and some of these things are sort of game, you know, the games that we play. But I think finding a way to be honest with oneself is the first thing about what one's doing in a situation, because there are euphemisms and all the rest of it. But but in terms of the virtues of communication, you have honesty, but also you have tact. Honesty can be brutal honesty. So you decide when is the time, and what is the time. I mean, that can be avoidance, and that's wrong. But it can also be thinking that now might not be the time for this, or somebody else might need to be brought in order for this to be the right time.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
So, but yes, honestly.
Thanks. Can you pass that back, please?
Well, I hope you won't get fed up with my voice from Patworth, but I'm just going to give you another case scenario of what I think was possibly a perfect outcome for someone that wanted to die, in terms of having motor neurone disease. Quality of life had got to the point where it was intolerable for this person to live like this, and the patient's family were struggling with letting go of this person.
Mm-hmm.
This person was struggling with letting her family down because she didn't want to carry on like this, and she was hugely still able to communicate. Mm-hmm. And got to the point where her respiratory situation was in the last stages, and there was a dilemma going on as how we would carry on, how would we get out of hospital, what were the choices. But the key thing that came about was her choice to end her life was in a very natural way. She decided to refuse the peg feeding that she was having. She decided to stop that, and we were lucky that we were able to support her and the team looking after her to say, this is okay. She really knows what she wants. She wants to stop the feeding. It won't be a particularly pleasant death, because she probably will be, you know, she's not actively dying, so she will be hungry. She chose, so I'm coming back to some other options of balancing goods here. She chose to be sedated at night so she could sleep, and be awake in the day so she could still talk to her family. Mm-hmm. And she had about another 10 days of living, but in this controlled, comfortable way, surrounded by the people that she loved. So it was a very careful balance of choices, supported by the medical team. So I thought it was a useful example.
I think there will be the issue of clinically assisted nutrition hydration is one that people, it has a kind of symbolic existence, which is in some ways like other parts of medicine, in some ways not, and in some ways like other kinds of eating and drinking, and in some ways not. And people think of it differently, both traditions, both individuals, both the person themselves and their families. But it is, in my experience, that there are many people who will be, I don't know about in this particular case, but certainly there would be many family members who would not be, for whom that would not be easy as a kind of decision. And there would be, and in terms of moral traditions, there would be a question about how much you see this as a kind of the basic sort of thing that we should look after ourselves and you have a duty to, and so, rather than something which is optional. Is it like medicine because it's a peg? I mean, a peg can get infected. A peg is an intervention, or is it feeding yourself? Do you have a duty to feed yourself as you have a duty to brush your teeth and tie your own shoelaces if you can? So is it something which is about the kind of looking after yourself, which is an ordinary thing, or is it something which is the kind of medical decisions about which we make those kind of decisions? And individuals and traditions differ on that. So I think that though you put it forward as a good death for this particular person, I think that some people will be concerned about it particularly because it was nutrition and hydration. But I think that in general, people coming to a point where they refuse various kinds of intervention, that often happens, and that can be a virtuous decision without a doubt.
Well, thank you. So let's stop for lunch now and thank the speakers, both of them again.